Rhetorical Quest.
So today we're going to talk a little bit about communication as it relates to perception and perception checking. We know there are all kinds of limits on perception. We know that we don't perceive everything. And some of those limits are just within the bounds of physics, right? So right now, my wife could be talking, but she's 3 miles away. And so if she is, I wouldn't know. I don't even have a perception of where she is. And sometimes the realities within physics actually change things before they get from one place to another. You can see these little girls here playing with prisms, right? And you can see the way that the light is changed. And so then, therefore, their perception of the light is changed just by physical objects and physical things that are happening. Our perceptions are also affected by biology. There are biological processes that go to us and our perception that are just part of it. We know that insects, right, can see wavelengths that human beings just can't see because they respond to those wavelengths in ways that human beings can't. We also know that people with two X chromosomes and people with an XY chromosome, their eyes function differently. So that people with the X chromosomes have more cones in their eyes that are receptive to color and receptive to things sitting still, things that are just in one place. Whereas those with XY chromosomes tend to perceive more things that are moving and perceive a less gradation in color. This is a fact. There's really no way around it. But even within individuals, I don't probably have exactly the same layout and design of cones and rods as another person. I have XY chromosomes as another person with XY chromosomes, right? I just don't. So I'm going to see things differently. And you hear about it a lot in heterosexual relationships, right? Where the woman often complains that the guy can't see something that is sitting right in front of him, right? Well, he can't, right? Because it's not moving. It's harder for the male eye to attend to things that are sitting. Whereas we do notice the people walking around a room, and sometimes that can be frustrating to other people too who are sitting with us, and we want them to be focused on us, but maybe we're sitting at a restaurant, right? And we're talking, but our eye is drawn to the movement of the wait staff walking around the restaurant. That's what we're going to look at rather than the person sitting still in front of us. And that's just biology. That has nothing to do with socialization. This is a biological fact. And since things like physics and biology affect perception, there's not much that we can really do about those, right? We can maybe make some certain kinds of glasses to adjust for certain things. But for the most part, there's not a lot that we can do about our physics or our biology. And so that's not what we really focus on when we're studying communication. There are, however, some influences on our perception that do have to do with communication. And those are the ones that we're going to focus on today. I'm going to use Adler, Proctor, and Manning's differentiation on these influences on perception. So they list selection, organization, interpretation, and negotiation as 4 personal influences that go on in our perception. So I'm going to talk about each of these. We do tend to select particular stimuli for our perception. We tend to select stimuli that are intense, stimuli that are repetitive, stimuli that are different, desirable, or fitting. Those are the ways that we kind of select which stimuli we're going to pay attention to. We tend to select stimuli that are more intense. When I was a kid, I remember being told that red cars get more speeding tickets. And I haven't done any research ever to know if that's true. But if it is, I would know why it is, because the police are more likely to just notice a red car. Once they notice it, they might check the speed, and that would be the reason. Like I said, I don't really know that that's true, but I can certainly understand why it would be true if it is, because I have those experiences myself, right? I walk in and I see this, bright light, or I see this flash of color, and I notice it, right? I notice my eye goes right to that. Or, I hear a loud boom and I get scared, right? And all of that is stuff where you have this intense stimulation. And so you suddenly are paying attention to that intense stimulation. We also tend to select stimuli that are repetitive, where we see it and then we see it again and then we see it again. And then we start to wonder, well, why am I seeing this everywhere? All right. It just seems to pop up again and again and again. And then we actually seem to notice it popping up more. The last 2 nights, I had a dream that had Denver in it, the city in Colorado. And it's not a normal thing for me to dream about Denver. And the fact that it happened once, I was like, okay, man, a dream with Denver in it last. Then last night it happened again, this dream with Denver in it, right? And so I noticed it because it happened again, right? And so you see things again, and then you see them again, and you tend to notice them again. I know somebody who is always, when they're complaining, who often, when that person is complaining, says, and once again, because at one point that person noticed a pattern. And then you start to pay attention to find the pattern over and over and over again, right? So it starts out, you notice a pattern, and then you might even see a pattern where there isn't so much one, because you say, and then you start to think, well, once again, this person is doing this thing. Well, if you're using that phrase, well, once again, you might look that you're just looking for the repetition because you saw the repetition once or twice or more. We focus on stimuli as well that kind of stand out, that are different than the previous stimulus that we've seen, or just this thing that doesn't fit, right? When I was a kid, there was on Sesame Street the song, 3 of these things belong together, 3 of these things are kind of the same. Anyway, sorry, but in that case, there would be, but one of these things just doesn't belong here. Now it's time to play our game. But we tend to notice that thing that doesn't belong. That thing that's just like, why is that here? Right? Why is that there? And this is good. So I've noticed in my face-to-face classes that if somebody has like green hair, I remember that student's name. Or if somebody just, is different than other people, I remember that and I catch it right away. And why is that? Just because it's different than what I'm seeing all the time. And that's why it stands out. And that's why I attend to it. And then later I end up remembering more about it. We also select what's desirable, right? When we're selecting things to perceive. And when I say desirable, I don't mean good. I mean, we tend to select things that we want to see, right? And that doesn't mean those things aren't real. You're just seeing what you want to see, some people say, implying that what they're seeing isn't really there. You just wish it were. No, the things that we select to see are there, but we notice them because they're the thing we want to see. When I was a kid, I grew up during the Satanic Panic, as they call it. And during that time, it was common for people to notice satanic symbols in our media and in our lives and point out that, that must be that there are Satanists controlling the world. And the thing with that is, if you look for satanic symbols, you will find them. I had one person tell me, as I was a little kid, third grade, told me that the fact that my teacher had made a 5-pointed star on my paper to show that I had done a good job meant that my teacher was probably a Satanist. Right? So you start looking for 5-pointed stars. You start looking for goats' heads. Not the things that poke you, but things that look like a goat. You start looking for a triangle inside a circle. You start looking for all these things that people told me these are satanic. And you're going to find them. You're going to find them over and over and over and over again. And that's what you're going to look for. The same as, once you start to say, well, what drives me nuts about my partner in this interpersonal situation is that my partner tends to eat all the raisins out of the trail mix and just leave me with peanuts. And so you see your partner eating a raisin, then you're like, noticing, right? You're eating a raisin. Because you were looking for that. And the fact that you were looking for it meant that you perceived it. Now your partner really is eating a raisin. But as you're using that to build up evidence for what you want to see, you select those stimuli that are the thing for which you're looking for and tend to ignore those stimuli that you're not looking for. And the last kind of thing that works into our selection is we select what is fitting. Okay, here's what I mean by that. You see this picture here of the guy reading the book, and there's a light. What do you think if you asked him, what were you looking at? Do you think he would say the light reflecting off the pages? I doubt it, right? He doesn't pay attention to the light. The light's there. It's entering physiologically and biologically and physically. He's seeing it, but he doesn't perceive it because he's focused on perceiving the words in the book, right? And lots of things are like that. When you're first learning to drive, it's really hard to pay attention to both the gauges and the road, right? And so you realize that if you look down at your speedometer to make sure you're not speeding, you're not looking at the road, right? You eventually learn to do that, but it is a learning process to look at both your gauges and the road. And this is kind of the difficulty that we have, is that we see things, we hear things, right? I might hear some children playing in the background behind me, but I'm not really focused on that right now. And so if you ask me, what were you perceiving? I probably start talking about the computer screen in front of me or something like that, not what I hear behind me, right? Because that's just not what I'm looking at. So we select what is fitting. And after we've gone through all that processing to decide what we're actually going to perceive, we then move on to the next state, which is we have to organize what we've perceived. So what do we do here? We now have to organize, and there's different things that go into our organization. One is we have to decide which of these things that we have somehow made it through all of our processes to choose to attend to it, to choose to actually let ourselves know it's there. We still have to decide what is the important thing in this situation, what matters here. And that process of organizing in our mind what is most important, what is least important, is going to affect then what we perceive the world as being. Next, we move through the perceptual schema and stereotypes. Now, these can be confusing to some people, and that's why I put them together. It's because there is an extent to which perceptual schema taken to the extreme are stereotypes, right? So if I'm out and about and I see a black man, right? So he's a black man. He's probably of African descent. And those are things that I can perceive about him as being pretty likely, and that fits into a perceptual schema. There's nothing racist about knowing that there is a black man here, right? There's no problem with that. Now, if I start to take some of the social stories that have been told to me about this is how black people behave, I move into stereotypes and, even into racism if I let myself go there, right? If I were to allow myself to fall into these stories, right? So you've got the perceptual schema, which is putting things into categories. And it's not wrong to put things into categories. It's necessary to put things into categories. But when you start to take those categories and make them the entire story of an individual, especially an individual person, but really any individual perception, then you start to move into stereotypes. And stereotypes are extremely problematic because they limit our perception in ways that aren't really accurate. The last thing is that we do in our organizing is we engage in punctuation. Now, punctuation is not like what you learned in your English class when we're talking about it in communication. So when we talk about punctuation here, we're looking at what do you see as the cause and what do you see as the effect. That's really what we're looking for. So we see something happen before it or simultaneously with it, and we think one thing caused the other thing. This is a common thing. We'll talk about it at another video where we talk about our emotions. But sometimes people say, you made me angry. And we know that another person can never make you angry. But we feel this need to put in this punctuation where there is a cause and there is an effect. And there's these two things happened. You did this thing and I was angry. And so I decided that you caused me to be angry. Right? We do a lot of things like that. And sometimes, most of the time, probably, we're right about this causes that, right? I turn the key on my car and it fires the ignition. My turning of the key was the cause of that. We can get all into kinds of first causes, second causes, and Aristotle and stuff like that, but we're not going to today. But yeah, the punctuation, how you decide what causes what the relationships between perceptions are. That's one of the ways that we organize our reality. So then we come to the last two. We have interpretation and negotiation. And so when we talk about negotiation, we're talking about kind of a rhetorical act of trying to get other people to adopt your perception. And when we talk about interpretation, we really go into narrative. So I want to focus just a little bit on the narratives that we use before I move on to talking about negotiation, which involves a very important thing called perception checking. When we start talking about interpretation and narrative, anybody who's really studied communication immediately jumps over to Walter Fisher. It's the first thing that comes to mind. Walter Fisher and his narrative paradigm. His narrative paradigm is this idea that people make decisions based on how things fit in their stories, right? So we hear lots of stories from other people. We experience lots of things and try and put them into stories. And when we do that, we look for two things. The first is narrative fidelity, right? So within the story that we're telling, does this make sense? So if you have the mama bear, the papa bear, and the baby bear come home from the walk, and the mama bear says, somebody's been eating my porridge, and the papa bear says, somebody's been eating my porridge, and the baby bear, well, doesn't say anything. Bears can't talk. We're going to throw that story out, right? We're not going to take that as a true story that we're going to apply to our life because you just said bears could talk. You had bears talking, and then you said bears can't talk. You contradicted yourself. And in those situations, we just tend to throw it out. We don't even think about it. When we have this thing that contradicts the story within itself, we just throw it out. We also tend to throw out things that don't fit into narrative coherence. Now, narrative coherence is all of the stories that you've told yourself that make up your worldview. So that when you hear a story from somebody else, when you perceive something, you think, does this fit with the stories I'm already telling, right? Maybe you are out and about and you see a little tiny person, and that little tiny person has little wings, flies into your field of view, lights up, and flies away. Um, you've got some choices there to make about this in order to make the story coherent. Maybe you had a hallucination, right? That could be a story that you tell yourself, and that would make sense because you've learned that there are no fairies, right? Or maybe you haven't fully accepted as coherent the idea that there are no fairies, and so you don't think it's a hallucination. You think, wow, I saw a fairy, right? And so you've got to make the story make sense in your other stories. Now, Ernest Borman took this idea of narrative in kind of a different direction. He noticed that we don't just do this ourselves. I'm not just making sense of my stories myself. I make sense of my stories with other people, right? And so maybe you'll tell me a story about a professor who was really mean to you. And then I'll think, oh, you know what? I remember this time when a professor was really mean to me. And we start telling these stories back and forth, right? And in this moment, while we're telling these stories, we build what Borman calls a fantasy theme. And some people think, well, fantasy is not real. It's likely real, but it's a way we've made sense of the world altogether. So it kind of ties in with narrative and with our next concept, which is perception checking. And the truth is, whether we articulate it this way or not, when we talk about perceptions, we all know these things. We know what a lot of the things affecting our perception are. And so we need to engage in perception checking. Perception checking is where you check out with other people. This is what I'm perceiving. Is this really what's going on? Now, this notion of perception checking isn't really a new idea. We can trace this all the way back to Plato and what he called dialectic, or what his translators call dialectic. So Plato here, he talked about how we can know what's true, we can know what's real by comparing with other people. And so as we interrogate our perceptions with other people's perceptions, we start to come closer to something that might be true. So Adler, Proctor, and Manning have a really good method that they describe in their textbook, Looking Out, Looking In, of how we can do perception checking, right? So we see something, we perceive something, and we know it could be one way or it could be another, right? And so you need at least two possible interpretations. Sometimes it's hard to find that second interpretation because we're always so married to the narratives that we already have. But you try and find two possible interpretations or more, and then go to somebody else who was maybe the person who did the behavior or was involved in the event and say, I see these multiple interpretations of the behavior. This is what I'm perceiving. Is this also how you would interpret your behavior or their behavior? Is this also what's going on with you? And when we do that, we can come a little closer to maybe a full perception. Now, they say there's Adler, Proctor, and Manning again say that there's a few things to consider when doing your perception checking. One is the completeness, right? So how much of the picture do you really have? How much do you really know of what's going on? Another is nonverbal congruency, right? And so sometimes what a person says is their perception doesn't match the way they're acting. And so do two things not quite mix. A third thing is our cultural rules. So our cultural rules and roles put us in more high context or low context cultures, right? So high context cultures are cultures where a whole lot of what is meant by something is carried through in the traditions and in the culture. Whereas in low context cultures, a lot more of what is meant by something takes place in the language itself and in explaining what you're going to do. So we sometimes call them high context cultures as allocentric because they're focused on looking at what's around stuff, Whereas low context cultures, we sometimes call them logocentric because they're more about explaining things. And then there's face saving. The person who's helping you with your perception checking might be trying to save face for themselves. No, 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 that's not what I meant. Because they realize that would be a bad persona to be putting out. Or they might be face saving with you, saying, oh, well, you're right, and trying to make you feel better. And either way, they're just trying to they're not trying to mess up your perception, but they're trying to give you a perception that helps you perceive somebody, maybe yourself, in a positive light. Now I'd really like to hear from you. Maybe do a bit of perception checking on me, right? So you've learned all of this stuff, or you understand all of this stuff about perception and perception checking, right? So what I want to know is, tell me about a time when maybe it would have helped if you'd done some perception checking, but you just went with your own perception. Or whether you realize that somebody else really would have done well to have some perception checking, but they really didn't, and that caused a problem in your friendship or your relationship or other aspects of your communication. All of that is really good. So if you're one of my students, what I want you to do is put it down in the discussion prompt below. I want you to talk about, how you've engaged in perception checking, should have engaged in perception checking, or maybe how somebody else has engaged in perception checking or should have engaged in perception checking. For the rest of you, those of you who are not my students in my class at WNMU, I would still love to hear from you, right? So I'd love for you to talk about these situations in the comments below.